Uh, Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the ThinkFest for organizing this panel. My name is Bilal Zahoor. I am the editorial director of Folio Books, a member of Hukuk-e-Khalq Party. I'm also teaching philosophy at Beacon House National University, Lahore. This is a session which I hope will unfold at the crossroads of climate crisis, new green energies, and the question of technology. Very briefly, the introduction of the panelists with us. I'm very pleased to have Maira on my left. She is a professor of architecture and design at COMSATS University. We have Waqar Zaidi with us from LUMS, who is a professor of the history of technology. We also have Aristotle Tympas, all the way from Athens, with us. He is a professor of history and philosophy of technology. And lastly, we have Khurram Bhatti with us, who is a professor at ITU, teaching computer science and also making some interesting technological interventions concerning disaster management. I very briefly want to take a start with the idea that I think we're living in times where climate crisis is something that's hard to deny, even by the, even by the kind of politicians or sort of propagandists who just a few years ago used to create lots of propaganda, and there used to be a very overwhelming denial around the question of climate change. That has probably started to change, but what troubles us the most as thinkers embedded in philosophy or history of technology is the idea that all of us are in a search of a proper and effective response to the climate crisis. The kind of response that has been emerging from within the existing economic and political order is a response that has an overwhelming fascination with technology. This is a response that makes us believe that by mobilizing technoscience, by undertaking large-scale technoscientific interventions, the climate crisis can be mitigated or adapted to without making any radical interventions to the system that brought us to the collapse, to the verge of collapse in the first place. So the problem, the irony that we see from within the existing economic and political order, which we call globalized, financialized capitalism, is that there's a kind of a fascination with technology that is being perpetuated, propagated intentionally, vehemently, and this is taking place through a number of mediums. So through visual culture as well as through films and documentaries and so on. So what we are witnessing is a kind of a presentation, is a kind of a projection of technology, of technoscientific interventions such as carbon removal technology, many other kinds of technology. So what we are being told is that by mobilizing technoscience, by making technoscientific interventions, such as by promoting carbon removal technologies, we can overcome the crisis of ecology, we can overcome the climate crisis without making important radical interventions to the system that brought us to the point of ecological crisis in the first place. So here's a kind of a gimmick that is taking place. There's a kind of a distraction that is also at the heart of the response of the existing economic and political order. That might seem and sound controversial to some of us, but the way I look at this response is something that the principle that informs this response is the one that is based in the idea of distraction. Distraction in the sense that all the time we are being told that it is only the technological heroism, it is only technology that can save us. It is only this messianic character of technoscience that can help us overcome the crisis. They don't want us to sort of look at the roots of the issue, the root of the problem, that where does this problem come from? Where does this crisis come from? The collapse that is just hovering over all of us, but more so hovering over the vast swathes of communities in the global south. And who can know this better than people living in Pakistan? We have floods in the monsoon, we have smoke in the winter, we have heat waves in the summer, and we have over 3,000 glacial lakes in the north that can be at the verge of outburst any time of the week. So Pakistan is experiencing a kind of a trans-seasonal vulnerability. And this trans-seasonal vulnerability is not unique to Pakistan. It's something that is prevalent in most parts of the global south, but not just global south. I think in many parts of the global north as well. Australian wildfires is becoming very much a norm these days. Wildfires in many parts of Eastern Europe as well. Even many of the rivers are evaporating in Germany as well. So there's a kind of a ubiquity of the ecological crisis, and this ubiquity is something that is exclusive to this crisis. It is something which has not been the characteristic of even the large-scale monsters that we have experienced in the past, such as the Great Depression in the 1930s, the oil crisis in the 1970s, or even the large-scale financial crisis in the 2008s. So here is a situation which is novel to many of us. This is a crisis which is ubiquitous, which is unique, which is unheard for compared to many of the crises that we have experienced in our lifetimes. Or the humanity in general. So the crisis demands an altogether radical shift in our approach. It demands an altogether new normativity. It demands the radical transformation of the coordinates of the system that generated this crisis in the first place. But today we want to deconstruct the response from the system in response to this crisis. And that response is a kind of a fascination with technology, a technoscientific messianism, or a technological heroism, as they call it. And I want to quickly go back to Aristotle first, Aristotle Tympas, to let us sort of help us deconstruct this response from the system, and also please help us go through the history of technology in a bit, but also the kind of alternative technological responses that you find have a lot of potential.
Just wonderful to be here and the opportunity to discuss this so important issue with you. As I'm sure we can agree, the future of mankind depends on the way we approach this issue, choosing technology. Closer? Thank you. Can we change it, please? Can we change the slide? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use history in order to point to a philosophy of design of technology that may get us out of this. These pictures we're familiar with. This is not clean technology. This is the technology that we want to move away from. Next, please. These are just uranium waste barrels. Also a familiar picture. Especially familiar is the picture of them being produced very frequently in Europe and ending up in countries outside Europe. You know the story, I'm not going to focus on this. The next one, please. Same picture here, being dubbed somewhere else. I want to focus on the next one. Can we please move on to the next one? Now, in my opinion, it's very critical to not just focus at the generation plan. Yes, thank you. Not focus on the generation plan and look at the full technology, the whole of the technology involved in the process. And here, in my opinion, the critical part is the long-distance transmission network. Hundreds, thousands sometimes of miles, 10,000s of miles in some cases, that make possible the following. Make possible here, for example, in this room, or in one room anywhere on Earth, to consume electricity generated from renewable sources, from wind and the sun, just as it is being mixed with all kinds of energy, all kinds of fossil fuel. The result being, and this is what we're experiencing in Europe and everywhere in the world, the result being not a replacement of fossil fuels by renewable fuels, but the overall expansion of fossil fuels as well. Because this long-distance transmission network, to operate, requires that you have as your basis the fossil fuels and their generation facilities, and you just end up the renewables, and then you add fossils and so on. And that's a problem. The next one, please. And you certainly don't want these long-distance transmission networks in your backyard. What you do want in your backyard, and here I may quickly share with you some pictures. The next one, please. This is a wedding in the 1930s in the United States. 500,000 households used these small wind turbines that you can see in order to make it to the advanced technological civilization. They were having access to radio, access to TV, refrigerator, basically all the electric appliances. That was 100 years ago. You can imagine how much easier it would be technically today to have an advanced technological civilization, state-of-the-art technology, massively installed, but in a decentralized manner. People were very happy to pose in front of these individually owned technologies, be owners of their means of energy production. What was missing here was the long-distance transmission network. Instead, they were having some batteries. I may repeat the years, 1930s. 500,000 at these type of structures. We can quickly go over the rest of the pictures. Again, posing in front of this. Next one, please. Happily posing in front of another one. Let's stop here for a second. It was not for free, but for the same amount that you would spend to buy an average car, like a Ford Model T, you could also buy the electricity infrastructure to be owned by you, to make you completely independent. I'm sure we can all agree that 100 years later, for a smaller amount, with a much more, even more reliable technology, this could be accessible to many, many people around the earth that could become completely independent without having to be connected to the grid. On the countryside, but also in urban environments. We've done many studies also in urban environments. Next one, please. This is one from Greece, similar structure. Let's move on, please. Again, you can see a valley here from interwar Greece. Completely independent. This is an advertisement. They were massively advertised in the US. Another advertisement, the next one. They were so sustainable, that they were tried in the Arctic and also in Africa. And several decades later, they were still operational. So you can see how sustainable they were already by then. Needless to say that the materials could be local instead of reproducing dependencies of 2-3 multinationals. They could be easily repaired and modified and adjusted to the local circumstances and the local uses. The next one, please. That's the North Pole. That's in the coal being used. Next one. I want to stop for a second here. Recall where we started, with a long-distance transmission network carrying fossil fuel-based electricity very far away. And nobody, of course, wants this in her backyard. Nobody wants to take a picture with this. Here, however, with the technological traditions that I'm talking about, people would love to take pictures with. In fact, I've actually written something on how Hollywood in the 1960s and the 1970s was depicting some aspects of this history that confirm how inviting was for people to be owners of these electricity generating infrastructures and also to pose in front of them. You can see here the two ladies actually taking pictures in front of this infrastructure. Next one, and yes. So I would argue that, and I'll conclude with this, that 100 years later, it's so possible to actually become so quickly independent and to move from a culture where all that matters is profit for big multinationals to a culture of care, because you need to care about not overspending, a culture of concern about your locality. That's technically so feasible, and in fact, and I may add this, so appropriate for countries with the technological traditions of many countries in Asia, because there were traditions that were much closer to this approach, to this philosophy, as opposed to the dominant philosophy of long-distance transmission. And as a matter of fact, can we please show one more? This is an article that I co-authored with an engineer, an electrical engineer from Athens, Greece, who is traveling around the world, and he's actually helping local communities build their own independent wind turbines. It's called an open structure. Can we see the last slide as well, please? These are open structures, like open source software. There are hundreds of engineers and technicians around the globe that are sharing the information on how to best adjust them locally. And there is a network around the Earth. It's called the Wind Empowerment Network. There is also one for solar electricity, where you can actually participate and share information on how to best build these infrastructures and make yourself, your community independent. They don't have to be individual in a sense, it's only a household that can have one. Municipalities, schools, neighborhoods can devise the appropriate scheme for their needs and thereby very quickly become independent and contribute to what is really clean energy. Thank you very much.
Aristotle, Tympas, for letting us know that the small-scale, open-source, community-based, locally repairable infrastructures were not just prevalent just a few decades ago, but were also not ugly. Clearly, no one wants to take a picture with solar panels or large-scale wind turbines today. I would quickly like to go to Waqar and take the discussion forward, especially concerning your work on nuclear energy. So because we are talking about the replacements of existing fossil fuel structures, Aristotle has a point to make concerning, say for instance, wind energy infrastructures, but he particularly likes to take forward the discussion on wind structures that are open source, not closed, also the ones that are small scale, locally repairable, instead of those large transmission lines that has been characteristic of many of the structures that we see today. What about the question of nuclear energy? So this is an important question because many of the, not just the mainstream thinkers, but also some of the philosophers have encouraged the idea of nuclear energy. For instance, James Lovelock, the founder of Gaia theory, has been vouching for nuclear energy, at least in the shorter span of time, if not in the longer run. So the question of wind energy as a replacement of existing fossil fuel structures.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. Nuclear supporters of nuclear energy, so this is energy generated from nuclear power plants, tell us that nuclear energy is relatively clean because you're not burning fossil fuels, right? And they tell us that nuclear fuel is plentiful and it is. So uranium is very commonly found around the world. But nuclear energy is deeply problematic for a very large number of reasons, actually. And fundamentally and philosophically, nuclear energy takes us in the opposite direction to the sort of technological solutions we've just been described here, right? So if these wind turbines are communal, they're local, they're relatively easily repaired, they can be shared, each community or household or group of households can have their own wind turbine. They are open source, the technology can be also shared amongst people. Nuclear energy is exactly the opposite. So nuclear energy is very, very, very expensive, right? It is centralized. In other words, you have nuclear reactors that can only be run by either governments or hugely government-subsidized corporations. They are heavily regulated. They produce energy in one location, which is then transmitted around using those high-tension cables that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. And of course, perhaps most worryingly, nuclear fuel, once it's used up, has to be disposed of. And so far, we don't really have very many cost-effective ways of cleanly disposing of used nuclear fuel, right? And there was a very shocking example of this very, very recently in the news. It was about a week ago where at Heathrow Airport, a plane landed coming from Oman, carrying some scrap metal that was loaded on in Pakistan. I don't know where in Pakistan, probably Karachi, but somewhere. And this scrap metal turned out to be radioactive. Okay, there were traces of uranium in this scrap metal. So what had happened was that there was some waste uranium that had been disposed of either in Pakistan by some entity in Pakistan, or it had been imported into Pakistan because Pakistan imports a lot of other countries' waste, which is then reprocessed here. And then uranium, which should be treated separately, instead got mixed up with all this metal, and some of it ended up in this scrap, which then, and this is the world of logistics, right? Strangely enough, was then re-exported back to London, where nowadays they have these scanners at these airports that scan for radioactive material because they're worried about bombings and things like that. And lo and behold, they discovered that there were traces of uranium. So disposing of uranium is very, very difficult. You have to do it very carefully. It needs to be done in a very controlled way. And this can only really happen in heavily regulated or government-run institutions, organizations. So nuclear energy is very different to the sorts of solutions we've seen here. Now, one of the big issues with nuclear energy is that it's very top-down. In other words, things are planned at the government level, and then these plants, anywhere around the world, they might be made by private corporations or by governments, but they're all planned at the national level by centralized governments. So nuclear energy is a very centralized and centralizing solution to the problems of clean energy that we're facing today. And in that sense, it is deeply problematic because it takes away agency, it takes away decisions from local communities and people, and especially gives them upwards to centralized governments, okay? At a very centralized level. Now, one may ask, well, what's wrong with that? What is wrong with having our central government in Islamabad making energy decisions for everyone in the country, 260 million people? But it is problematic. It's problematic because, as a historian, I've studied the history of these big centralized techno-scientific projects. I think Apne used that phrase, techno-scientific projects, and typically they fail. They almost always, not always, but a lot of them are failures. They fail to produce the cost savings that they're promised. They fail to deliver what the energy or whatever it is that they're promising to local communities. And they fail for a number of reasons. But one of those reasons is often these big projects are not sensitive to the needs of local communities and local people. All right? And the big example of this are dams. Okay? Big dams, the sorts of dams that used to be built around the world in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s in Pakistan, Darbela Dam, many others, they're largely failures, right? They're failures because they're very expensive. They're built on the basis that they will cost, $500 million, and they end up costing $1 billion or $2 billion, whatever it is. They're hugely expensive. They don't function the way they should function. They get silted up, or they don't produce enough electricity. And they often have very bad side effects. They destroy local ecosystems. They completely change water systems, have unintended side effects. And then, of course, they tend to be very bad for local communities who are often forced out of their land, or they find there are all sorts of local ecological changes. Okay? So centralized solutions within this big sort of capitalist system within which we all sit, the system of consumption and overconsumption, just ke andar hum kind of phase mein hain, right? We can't really, it's difficult to break out of that. We're in that system, but within that system, this centralized solutions are really problematic. So the one thing I would say is that moving forward, technology is not the solution to our environmental and climate problems. In fact, the problems and their solutions are actually largely political and social, maybe economic, political, economic, social. But technology has a role to play, and I want to generalize from what my friend Aristotle said here. I want to generalize and say that we need to think about solutions and technologies at the community level, at the more local level, right? In fact, at multiple levels. The federal government has an important role to play, but so do different layers of government. So do provincial governments. In fact, so do municipal governments. So do local communities, yeah? And so do individual households, right? The solution to these problems, insofar as we can achieve them within this system, have to be done at lower levels and at multiple levels. Now, of course, we need government and state intervention at the very top. But that state intervention and state projects should take into account what locals want, right? There should be consultative policy making that takes all the stakeholders into account in a realistic way, okay? Rather than just paying lip service. Technologies, I think as historians, one thing we say is that technologies should be appropriate, right? The solution should be appropriate to the problems. They should be appropriate given the culture and the context in which they're going to be used, all right? That's very, 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 very important, which often means that the same technology can't work in the same situation, right? Which is one reason why we do need local decision making, yeah, on this. Pakistan is a huge country. It's very varied, many different cultures, many different languages, ethnicities, many different ways of living. We need to be aware that a technology that can work in one city might not work in another city or another town or another village. I think the final thing I just want to say is that one of the big issues we face is because increasingly we are locked into particular technologies, particular technological systems. Part of the problems we have is that a technology doesn't exist by itself, right? For a technology to work, you need a system that goes along with it. Take, for example, the car, right? The petrol-driven cars are a disaster, okay? They are a big problem. They're really bad for the environment. We already have enough of them. we need to find different transport solutions, yeah, into the mix. But the problem is that the car is embedded in a bigger system. The car doesn't work by itself. To have cars, you have roads, you have petrol pumps, you have transporters that transport the petrol pumps, you have car manufacturers, you have mechanics. So there's a whole system that goes with it. Once a system is up and running, it has its own life, its own momentum. It's very difficult to stop it or to change it. Yeah? That's sometimes called technological lock-in. Yeah? It's the same with many systems. For example, electricity. One of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to break away from centralized energy production and distribution is because we've created this system of grid distribution, right? So once the system is up and running, it's very easy for a policymaker to say, yeah, system to bana hua hai, transmission to bani hui hai, let's just build a nuclear power plant at one end, or system is already there. It's very difficult for people to imagine that you can break out of this and break into something which doesn't use the system. Okay? Ek dafa system ban jata hai, you have people who are part of the system whose livelihoods are part of the system, right? And they might be good people, they're hardworking people, they're honest people, but they're part of the system, so they help to produce and reproduce that system, that electricity system or a petrol-driven car system. Okay? If we want to think about other types of, let's say, ways of doing things, let's say solar or wind, then we are thinking about creating new types of systems. Okay? And they are difficult to bring in, but I think that's where the challenge is. Thank you.
Thank you, Waqar, for this information. It was very insightful. I want to quickly move to Maira. Your work concerns the architectural intervention into environment, into the built-in environment. Could you let every one of us know a little more about the significance of architecture and design in our aspiration of sustainability?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here at this thought-provoking discussion where we're discussing our future generations and how we can make solutions without compromising on the needs of future generations, which is sustainability. So I would like to draw your attention towards the built environment, and climate is basically affected most with the built environment. And if we talk about architecture, there are very simple ways of architecture which we have forgotten, and we've gotten into this very complicated ways. We have forgotten the passive ways of architecture, which includes just by orienting your building in a way that you can use maximum sun and you can use maximum sunlight, and you can avoid the heat by using insulating materials. You can make a house or a building or a facility which is energy efficient, and you are definitely then not going to compromise on the burning of fossil fuels, on pollution, and all of these issues. So if we take care of that, then we are not designing according to the site-responsive architecture. We're not taking care of the context of the site we're designing in. When we're designing for hilly areas, the architecture is completely different. We cannot implant a multi-story building which is placed in Dubai and we can just bring it and plant it here in Lahore. It will lose its context, it will lose its material, it will lose the richness, it will lose the culture. So it's very important to talk about the cultural appropriation, the community involvement in architecture has played a very important role in all the generations. From Stone Age to we're now sitting in 2023, each and like the habitat has been important role in every society, and we have completely forgotten the basics that keeps the communities together, that keeps even if we talk about the way the buildings were made, if we talk about the architecture of Sindh, which is the whole community was involved in making of those buildings and making of those houses. But now we have just implanted different technologies and we have forgotten the context of the site. So I think it's very important to draw our attention towards how we can play, how technology can play an important role by using vernacular techniques which are local to, which are rich in context with the local context, and then we can promote that. And then also working on climate action and climate change. I think this is the decade of action where we really need to work on all the sustainable development, on work on renewable energy, how we can use renewable energy like solar power, like wind power, like geothermal power, but keeping in mind the context. So basically, that's all that I want to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maira. Absolutely. So that draws my attention to, as you drew our attention to the importance of technology. So clearly, I don't want to seem misleading that we are taking a position against technology. The problem lies at a much more fundamental level that, yes, technology can be brought into use in our aspiration of alternative green futures, but we are taking a position against the idea of presenting technology as a hero, technology as a messiah, without bringing about radical changes to the system at large. I mean, speaking of good technologies, I want to move to Khurram Bhatti, who has been engaging with a number of projects in the northern part of Pakistan, where you're making some really interesting technological interventions which can pre-disaster, in the pre-disaster kind of phase, but please let us know more about it.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Bilal. And somehow the turn comes at the right time because all of you have spoken of the issue in good detail and it was enlightening as well. So let me give the disclaimer first. I'm the guy who does the technology. So I'm going to try to respond to what Bilal highlighted in his opening remarks, and then Maira pointed out, and Aristotle and Waqar said. So let me start with the energy part, because this is what we are talking as a session. It's about the clean energy. Technology certainly is part of the solution, I would say, not part of the problem. And I would try to give you some good examples of that as well. So looking at the energy mix of the country at the moment, we have around, in the last 5 to 10 years, the energy mix on the production side that Pakistan had, unfortunately, is around, it varies between 60 to 75% of fossil fuel, 20 to 25, 29% of hydropower, and that clean energy part is hardly 9% at best. So you can see where we stand as a country when it comes to the production side. Speaking of the problem part, we need to also see where we stand in terms of consumption. So the consumption mix, I don't have the numbers unfortunately for the country because there was no authentic source available, but globally it is a set pattern that a major part of consumption patterns or consumption mix goes to the transportation that was rightly highlighted by Waqar towards the end of his statement. So transportation contributes a major consumption mix of almost every country, developed countries as well. So if you want to go towards the solution part, as Bilal just said, maybe we need to think where we stand in terms of the consumption of fossil fuel. Also, even in technology, although it is more deterministic when it comes to solutions or technology, but you will still find a lot of noise that actually creates a negative perception about technology and its uses. So this is what I feel. For instance, in Pakistan, you might have come across various statements which are not actually wrong, but they are not right as well. For example, we do have some claims about our potential reserves of coal energy, or our potential reserve about hydropower energy that we can produce. But we do not talk about the intrinsic details. We do not talk about the challenges that prohibit us to actually convert those solutions into viable production of those energy. So that's where probably the negative perception and negative image of technology also comes forward. Anyway, going back to the usage and, you know, so one thing is for sure that we need to get rid of fossil fuel, as Aristotle also mentioned, and he has shown wonderful pictures of we were better off before, and we can go back to that as well. So the clean energy sources primarily are, you know, wind energy and the solar energy at the moment that we have abundant, but the technology needs to develop. We have wind corridors in Jampi, for example, in the south. We have solar energy abundantly available in Punjab, but what we don't have our own solar panel industry. It is not there. So we tend to be, as I was saying before the session started, that we tend to look like very tech-savvy nation, but we are actually not. We are not using the technology for the right purposes. So that brings me to what Bilal just said, that maybe technology for the better causes. So climate is one issue that every one of us seen, and the whole year we have been struggling, and still we are, you know, going through a lot of trouble because of that. So let me just give you two example projects that Bilal just pointed out to, where technology could be used to help our people, to help our economy. We are working on some projects on glacial lake outburst floods. This is a phenomena that occurs in the glaciated regions of the world. Pakistan has a lot of glaciated region. It is the entire HKH region has probably the biggest ice chunk after the polar regions, as we say. You can find in literature as well. So this is the part where we have the freshwater sources, and the technology that we are using, it is basically a project that is funded by the National Geographic to look at the potential of glacial lake outburst floods. So these are phenomena which cause instant release of water out of these glacial lakes, and they cause a lot of damage in the downstream community. So we are using remote sensing, satellite technology coupled with machine learning to actually develop some early warning systems for the local community. So as Waqar said, the solutions sometimes are too centralized. In certain cases, like nuclear, of course it is, but centralization is not always a bad idea. In this case, particularly, we were working in Chitral Valley. It was a decentralized issue, local to that community, and we managed to develop an early warning system based on remote sensing data, based on our own machine learning algorithms that our own students developed. And we were able in 2021 to prevent such an event from happening. And we're very proud of that, because we were just 1 year down the line in the project and we managed to do it. Similarly, we are doing some use of technology in the south. Pakistan exclusive economic zone is facing a lot of oil spill issues, which are not easy to detect because of the scale of the marine environment. So we are using some technology there as well to help the government to actually protect the marine ecosystem, the environment, and so on and so forth. You can quote a lot of examples. The idea here is that technology, if used for the right reasons, can be actually and is the way forward. Yes, we can talk about, we can try to remove the negative perception, we can try to reduce the noise in technology as well, but I'm pretty convinced, given my entire career so far in technology, that way forward, whether we talk about the clean energy, whether we talk about our prevailing climate issues, whether we talk about industrialization or automation in the government and private sector, technology has been helping us in so many ways that probably it will be unfair to cast a negative image of the technology overall. Yes, there are people who are abusing it. There are people who are creating a misperception. Maira talked about architecture. I mean, urban resilience is such an important issue at the moment that I know LUMS is working a lot on that. So, a lot of urban resilience, urban planning involves technology these days. So, I would leave it with this thought, and maybe we can open for questions probably later. So, I'm an advocate of technology for its good uses. Thank you very much.
Although anyone has a question?
Mentalist policies and the technological mechanism is the only way forward. I think, and I would ask is about the indigenous epistemologies, the good living, quasi-swak, the indigenous term that we say for the good living. So can we resort to the indigenous epistemological epistemologies to locate the crisis? Or just go for the a technological mechanism?
Anytime, whenever there is a sequence, and what is that sequence? The sequence is that, greater rain than the average rain a year, followed by a slightly higher temperature that year. So whenever that sequence meets, the lakes experience an outburst, and this is what happened in the 2009-2010 floods in the KP and other parts, the northern parts. So the idea then is that, okay, so there is a disaster, there's a crisis, there are lakes, glacial lakes that are ready to outburst. There are rainfalls that can increase in number any year, just like it happened this year in Pakistan. So the question then is that the crisis is very much there. Okay, so what do we do in response to a crisis? One, we try to manage the crisis. We try to mitigate its effects. We try to adapt to it. So that's fine, wonderful. We have to manage the crisis. We have to mobilize all the possible technologies, all the possible resources, all the political and public support in order to mitigate the effects of the crisis, in order to at least ameliorate, in order to at least lessen the ramifications of the crisis. But is this the larger solution to the problem? Absolutely no. I mean, we have to manage the crisis, yes, but at one point, we have to go to the roots of the crisis and try to eradicate the sources that have been in the foundational sources driving the crisis. And that is where politics come in. And that is where Waqar drew our attention, that the solution, yes, mitigation, absolutely, adaptation, yes, managing the crisis, yes, make small dams, do all the political and managerial interventions that can help us lessen the effects, lessen the sort of, the ramifications of floods and other disasters and so on. But at one point, we have to start asking this question that, will this be enough? No, this will just be us living within the small, narrowed, constricted vision of managing the crisis. We have to, at one point, overturn the crisis, get rid of the foundational drivers. And that is where we talk about the larger system in question. And the larger system in question has one major problem, also a political and cultural problem, and that is the hyper-consumerist culture, particularly of the global north. But this is a disease that has been spreading in many other parts of the world. So there's a very luxurious, energy-intense lifestyle on the one hand, and hyper-consumerism on the other, that is at one level at the heart of the problem. Sorry for taking so long, but if you could just...
मैं पूछूं कि जो पहली विंड टर्बाइन इस्तेमाल करते थे वो इंफ्रासाउंड प्रोड्यूस नहीं करती थी.
Very quickly, thank you for your questions. What stops us from changing things? The easy question would be interest, material interest. If you're making huge profits out of the energy production, transmission, and consumption, then you don't want things to change. However, very important, and that's what I was focusing on, was ideology. The ideology is a material force. People believe that there is no alternative. People believe that high technology, prestigious technology, has only to do with huge, for example, wind towers. Whereas in fact, high technology is the technology that can best serve the needs of a democratic society, of an egalitarian society. So what stops us is, of course, interest, but interest as articulated, as connected to a certain ideology. An ideology that thinks only more technology, higher technology, technology that does not start from community is the solution. I would insist on the technological part. And just one point, as an historian, I'm sure you know this best, if you look at the way nuclear energy was portrayed in the 1950s, they were talking, the government was funding projects in 3 years to actually have individual nuclear reactors installed on each automobile. And people were believing this. It was ideology. It's so difficult to move beyond what is being served to us in order to see what's actually realistic, possible, and desirable. And in regards to your question about, I have a colleague in Greece, he's actually a professor at Tallinn University, who has introduced the very appealing concept of cosmolocalism. It's cosmos, the world, but also local. And his idea, with which I fully agree, and that's behind the open source technology, from software to energy technology, is that you have to respect the indigenous